you very much indeed. James Davis and then Graham Stringer.
Thank you, Chair. So we've already discussed research at length and the fact that we don't know what we don't know, but a very quick basic question about the balance between fundamental and applied research in mycological sciences. Is the balance right currently? And if not, how should it be changed? Dr. Merlin, to start, please.
So there's actually just a new Centre for Applied Mycology at Cranfield, which is really good news. I'd say, on the whole, applied mycology had more investment because there are more promise of a return from that knowledge. Fungi can be well established in industry, in fermentation, for example, and production of citric acid, using Aspergillus fungi. These are well woven into the fabric of long-established industries. And so I think the basic research is, I think the balance is probably the neglect of basic research, and so that could be addressed, and of course the basic research will then have lots of potential for application.
May I add to this? Yes. I totally agree, and I should also mention that the medical mycology is quite strong in the UK, but to my surprise, I joined Kew 2 years ago as the head of fungal taxonomy group, and I then recognized that actually I have to apply, I'm glad to UKRI funds on different topics, because the fungal taxonomy and diversity research is very unlikely to be supported, and that was a very interesting, striking example, and I think that's something what can be addressed. And for this, I'm now recruiting, and I think it's quite an interesting consequence and example. We announced the position of fungal taxonomist at Kew Gardens, and we got 42 applicants, and from them only one was a person from the UK, and this person had a degree in zoology or molecular biology, not in mycology. So I think that illustrates that this in numbers that there are no right now UK trained experts in fungal taxonomy and basic mycology that I'm really inviting to address in their entire program, from school education up to UKRI fundings, meaning PhD positions and projects, because that is really an underlying need for this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I'm going to turn to James Davis and then Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair. So we've just discussed the symbiotic relationship between plants and fungi, but how important do you think that is in the face of a changing climate and other environmental stressors?
Yeah, I think this for me. Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, critically important. I mean, what we need to remember is that these associations between plants and fungi have existed since the dawn of plant terrestrialization. So we're talking 500 million years. Yeah. So they're as old as the plants themselves. And they've played a critical role in actually building the terrestrial biosphere as we know it. And in doing that, they've had a really influential role on sort of the development of our atmosphere. So, I mean, a lot of the air that we breathe, it can be attributed to the actions of these mutualistic fungi in the soil around us. And in turn, that composition of the atmosphere leads to climate and weather patterns and stuff.
And if I might just add briefly, there is evidence that climate change can also affect the plants themselves. So things like plant exudates that come out of the roots, those very much influence the microbial composition of the roots. Yeah. And that means that whereas we've got beneficial ones at the moment that promote plant growth and protect them from diseases, there is a risk that we're going to get these changes because the plants are under stress that might have detrimental impacts on the microbiota itself.
Yeah. So. And I would just build on that as well, in that a changing climate has direct effects on the mycorrhizal associations themselves. So a lot of the research that we've done in my group shows that the actual functionality, so the amount of benefit the plant gets from the fungus, and the amount of carbon that the fungus gets from the plant, it's very dynamic and it's very dependent on climatic conditions like carbon dioxide concentration, temperature, so on. So it's a very...
And if we're looking at mainstream agriculture and using fungi to our benefit. What role do you think the government has in promoting that with industry and farmers?
List. Absolutely. So I think fundamentally the main thing is to distill out the fact from fiction in this area. We need to be promoting evidence-based messaging, and also kind of implementing regulations on sales and effectiveness and standards for things like bioinoculants, certainly, but also putting in place sort of regulations and policies that let farmers, or I think let's the wrong word, but allows farmers to do these sort of management systems profitably so that they can make what they need to from the land, but also enhance the fungal symbioses. I think we've touched on it in the previous session, you know, there's a chronic underfunding in this area, I guess because it's beneath the soil surface and we can't see it and it's not an instant result. And funding cycles tend to be on 3 to 5 if you're lucky. This is simply too short term to implement the sort of research programs that would really make a difference in this area. So longer funding programs, not necessarily more money, but it's the time, particularly when you're working in agricultural systems, to run field trials, which take years to establish, and then you've got the cycle. That's one of the primary challenges, I think.
Thank you. Forgive me, James, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. There's one further question, really, because you touched on the idea of regulations that could be put in place to move us forward in this area. So one area was mis-selling, I think. Another was helping farmers be more profitable when they're using fungi. And then there's also, I suppose, safety, isn't there? But to what extent do existing regulations not already cover those areas, do you think? Do you have an idea of the nature of the regulations required?
Again, I'm not an expert in that area, so I don't want to say too much. But certainly one example that I do have a little bit of knowledge about is in regenerative agriculture, one of the key principles is the reuse of waste products and recycling of waste into the system. So part of that is quite often using sludges, slurries, manures to improve the nutrient content of the soils and the carbon content and all of that sort of stuff. However, the treatment of these waste products isn't currently sufficient to remove all of the bioactives that are present in there. So things like pharmaceutical products, so personal care products, veterinary medicines, they can reach the soil. A project that I'm involved with at the moment, looking at the impact of these bioactive compounds at this soil concentrations, is actually showing that although it doesn't impact the communities of fungi living in the soil, it has a devastating impact on what they're doing. So actually, by implementing that without the correct regulation of the treatment of the waste, you're having this indirect effect on minimising the impact the fungi could be making on the crop. So there's all these layers of different regulation that I think,
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, James Lid.
Well, if I could
James,
just come in very quickly, because it's very interesting, the concept that we eat more fungal-based foods. But what about cost? If we're looking at cost of living, pressures on families, how are they a solution in that respect? Maybe not now. Do you think they will become so?
I mean, I don't want to speak just about corn, of course. You know, it's a more general thing. So even looking at traditional mushrooms, those are a very good food stock. They haven't got the protein levels of the mycoprotein, but in terms of nutrition, they've got very good roughage, very good vitamins. And there are a variety of mushroom species, of course, not only the button mushrooms. If you look in Asian countries, shiitake, oyster mushrooms are eaten as quite a staple food. Those are relatively cheap. Even things like the mycoprotein are relatively, they're not super expensive. You know, they are slightly a premium product, but they are excessively so. And I think in a broader sense, you do have to consider the general environmental issues as well, because although meat might seem cheaper in the short term, given the growing human population globally and the environmental impacts of the CO2, the methane emissions, you could argue there are hidden costs that perhaps we should be accounting for.
Thank you. Let me turn to James Davis and then Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair. So continuing the theme of antifungal resistance. We know that's a problem, but is there sufficient recognition that it's a problem? Should we start on the international level with Professor Stadler, please?
Well, as I have stated before, much more money goes to AMR, microbial resistance against bacteria. We are even developing some antiparasitic compounds and so on, and now even to a lesser extent with natural products, also the antiviral drugs, of course, have become more of a focus. But I think we should actually invest more in the discovery of new antifungal drugs. Mm-hmm. There's only one single new compound drug that made it to the market based on fungal metabolites and fumafungins. And there's not much in the pipeline as far as I can tell. Mm-hmm. While we have now, due to the efforts that have been made in the last 10 years, we have a lot of new antibiotics that are acting against bacteria in the pipeline that are now at least in late preclinical studies. And I would rather, if we had more candidates in our pipeline for antifungals, because you always have a high attrition rate. It's not difficult to find new compounds that act against bacteria or fungi, but with the fungicides, as other people have already said, it's always a problem with the selectivity. Sometimes you see some toxic side effects even only in the animal model, and then you have to stop a project after 4 or 5 years of intensive research. And this is also something we have to keep in mind, the timeline for discovery. I mean, we are now about to launch an antibiotic against bacteria, even also against nematodes, after almost 10 years of intensive research, and we are not yet. Hopefully we will be in the clinics next year.
Right.
So we have to start early. This is what I wanted to stress.
Thank you. So if you are a policy maker, is it really investment, is it money that is the main issue here, rather than expertise or other matters? With regard to anti-infectives as such, it's of course also one reason that all the big pharma companies suddenly or gradually dropped out of the business. That the reason is that no matter which kind of drug you develop, you will always have to invest the same kind of money. And we are not talking about, let's say, £2 billion. And until you really are on the safe side and can make some money out of it. And of course, it's much more lucrative to develop an anti-diabetic drug or blood pressure lowering agent than an antibiotic that will in the end just be kept as last resort, will only be used to treat a relatively small number of patients in the hospital, maybe for their lifetime in 3 weeks. And then on the other hand, if you are doing a good job and develop a drug like the statins that people can take, will then take over 20 or 30 years of their lifetime, packet a week. This makes a big difference. And this is, of course, also some commercial aspect that has to be considered. But this also means that the public must do more to develop these drug candidates. Yeah, thank you very much. Lastly, from me, Professor Fisher, is there anything you'd particularly like to see in the government's AMR strategy in respect of this?
Well, certainly the UK government 2019 AMR strategy mentions fungal infections in the glossary, but not in the text. So I think we need to get it into the text.
Right. That'll be a start. Okay.
Very good. Thank you very much. Chris Clarkson.